Frozen Vengeance. Apache princess saves bounty killer in Bitterroots 1880. The Bitterroot Mountains in the winter of 1880 were a land of ice and silence. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the jagged peaks and deep valleys, turning the world into a quiet white wilderness. The wind howled like a restless spirit, cutting through trees and whistling across the frozen ground. It was a place where only the strong survived, where nature did not forgive weakness, and where a single mistake could cost a life. In this frozen land, the bounty hunter rode alone, his horse struggling through the deep snow, each step sinking into the icy crust that covered the mountains. The man was known far and wide, both feared and respected for his skill in tracking dangerous outlaws. He had brought many men to justice and had survived countless battles, both with lawbreakers and with the harsh wilderness itself. But even the most skilled men could falter, and the mountains had a way of humbling the proud. The bounty hunter had learned this lesson many times, but this winter seemed colder, harsher, and more merciless than any he had known before. He wrapped his coat tightly around his shoulders, the fabric stiff with frost, and pulled his scarf higher over his face. His fingers were numb, almost frozen, yet he still clutched his rifle. He knew the danger he carried was not just from the cold, but from men who wanted him dead. The bounty hunter had enemies, men who had lost brothers, friends, or fortunes because of him. And now, some of those enemies had tracked him into the Bitterroots, thinking they could finish what he had started. As he rode, memories of past hunts and close calls ran through his mind. He remembered the faces of men he had captured, the faces of families who had feared the men he brought to justice, and even the faces of those he had failed to save. There was pride in his work, yes, but also a heavy weight, a constant reminder that life was fragile and fleeting. He had grown used to danger, but even he could feel the unease creeping in with each passing hour. The storm had begun earlier in the day. Snowflakes, delicate at first, had grown into thick, swirling flakes that blinded his vision. The wind whipped through the trees, making branches snap like brittle bones, and covering familiar paths with layers of fresh snow. The bounty hunter had hoped to reach a small cabin he knew in the mountains, a place where he could rest and plan his next move. But the storm had grown too fierce, and the cold was relentless. His horse, exhausted and slipping on the ice, shivered as if it too felt the bitter weight of winter. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the white landscape. The bounty hunter froze, listening. The silence of the mountains was broken by a faint crunch of footsteps in the snow, too deliberate to be the wind. His instincts told him danger was near. He tightened his grip on his rifle and scanned the area. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and he saw a figure. Another man, mounted and partially hidden by the snow. The bounty hunter's heart pounded. He knew that if this man was one of his enemies, he could be dead before he even drew his weapon. He considered turning back, but the storm had cut off any escape routes. The mountains were unforgiving, and in the snow, even a horse could become trapped. There was nowhere to hide, and nowhere to run. The hunter squared his shoulders and prepared for what might come. The figure called out, his voice muffled by the wind, but clear enough to be heard over the storm. "You there!" "Halt!" The bounty hunter hesitated. The voice was familiar in its tone, but the words carried danger. He had been recognized. He knew that in the mountains, recognition could be fatal. He spurred his horse forward, hoping to outrun whatever was coming, but the snow was deep, and the horse could not move fast enough. A shot rang out, echoing through the mountains like thunder, and the bullet grazed the bounty hunter's shoulder, cutting through his coat and drawing a line of blood. Pain shot through him, sharp and biting, but he forced his horse onward. The man chasing him was skilled. He had prepared for this pursuit, and he knew the terrain better than most. The bounty hunter could feel the eyes of his pursuer, calculating, waiting for a mistake. The snow made every step treacherous, and the wind carried the sound of breaking branches and snapping ice. One wrong move could send horse and rider tumbling down a frozen slope. Exhaustion began to take its toll. The bounty hunter's muscles ached, his body screamed for rest, and the cold seemed to seep into his very bones. He knew he could not keep running forever. Every decision now was a matter of life and death. He had to find shelter. He had to survive the night, and he had to find a way to turn the tables on the man who hunted him. Then, Through the blizzard he saw it, a small shape tucked between two trees, almost hidden under the snow. A cabin, barely visible, smoke rising from its chimney. It was a faint promise of warmth, a fragile hope in the frozen mountains. The bounty hunter guided his horse toward it, praying it was unoccupied. The snow grew heavier, wind more vicious, but he pushed onward. As he approached the cabin, a figure appeared in the doorway. The bounty hunter could not see clearly, but the stance was firm, confident, and unafraid of the storm. This person, whoever they were, held something in their hands, ready to act, ready to defend. The bounty hunter realized that his fate might not lie with the mountains alone, but with this stranger. He dismounted, his body trembling from cold and pain. Every movement felt like an effort against the icy wind. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture of peace, though he was prepared to fight if necessary. The figure studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding without words. The cabin door opened wider, and the bounty hunter was guided inside. Warmth hit him like a wave. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wooden walls offering protection from the storm. For the first time that day he could breathe without the sharp sting of the wind in his lungs. The stranger moved quickly, bringing blankets and water, examining his wound with careful hands. The bounty hunter realized he owed his life to this person, whoever they were. In the Bitterroots, survival was a gift, not a right, and he had been given one he had not earned. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin there was a fragile peace. The bounty hunter sat by the fire, feeling the blood warm again in his veins, and thought about what the next days might bring. The mountains were still dangerous, his enemies still hunted him, but for now, he was alive. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. The mountains waited silently, patient and unforgiving. The bounty hunter knew that he could not stay in the cabin forever. He would have to face the cold, the snow, and the men who wanted him dead. But for tonight, he was safe. And in that brief moment he allowed himself to feel hope. A small, fragile hope that perhaps he could survive the Bitterroots and live to see another day. In the quiet, the bounty hunter reflected on the dangers of pride, skill, and reputation. He realized that even the most capable men were vulnerable in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mountains had reminded him of this harsh truth. And as he drifted into a restless sleep by the fire, he understood that the frozen land had not been defeated, only endured. Survival would demand courage, cunning, and trust, and perhaps, he thought, the stranger who had saved him was a part of the story yet to unfold. Outside, the wind howled, snow drifted in thick waves, and the Bitterroots held their secrets close. But inside, by the fire, a man who had been hunted, wounded, and nearly lost began the slow, painful journey of recovery. In a land where every day could be a battle for life, tonight he had won a small victory. And the mountains, though merciless, had given him a chance. The Apache princess lived quietly in the Bitterroots, far from the life she had known as a young girl. Her name was whispered only in memory among her people, a name that carried strength and sorrow. She had left her home long ago, forced to wander after a raid had scattered her family and tribe. The mountains had become both her prison and her sanctuary. Here she had learned to survive alone, to read the signs of nature, to hunt, gather, and protect herself without anyone's help. The winters were harsh, but she was harsher still, shaped by loss and by the wisdom of her ancestors. She lived in a small cabin tucked between two ridges, built carefully to withstand the cold and hidden from wandering eyes. Smoke rose from the chimney, a faint curl against the gray sky, marking the presence of life in the frozen wilderness. The princess had learned to depend on no one. She trusted the silence of the mountains more than the words of men. Visitors were rare, and she preferred it that way. She knew that most strangers brought danger, yet sometimes she could not escape the pull of fate. It was during one particularly brutal snowstorm that she first saw the bounty hunter. He had collapsed near a frozen stream, his horse struggling and slipping in the snow. At first, she only noticed the tracks, deep impressions in the fresh powder. moving toward her cabin. There was something familiar in the hurried pace, the erratic pattern of the footprints, and she instinctively knew it was a man in danger. Her eyes, sharp and careful, followed the trail until she spotted him, collapsed and nearly covered in snow. The bounty hunter looked smaller in the snow than he had on the wanted posters. His coat was torn, his face streaked with blood and frost, and his breathing was heavy. His horse had bolted, leaving him alone and vulnerable. Most people would have ignored him, let him die, and moved on. But the princess could not. Something in his struggle reminded her of her own past, the fight to survive against forces larger than herself. She had seen too many lives lost to indifference. She had learned that survival was precious and sometimes demanded compassion, even for strangers. She acted quickly. Moving silently through the storm, she wrapped her own cloak around him, shielding him from the wind. Her hands were strong yet gentle, steadying his body as he shivered violently. She could see the frost forming on his hair and beard, the blood freezing on his skin. Every second counted, and she knew that if he stayed in the open much longer, he would not survive. Carefully, she lifted him and guided him toward her cabin, each step a battle against snowdrifts and icy terrain. Inside, she set him near the fire, pulling blankets and hot water from her supplies. She examined his wounds carefully. The bullet in his shoulder had not hit any vital organ, but it had torn through muscle and frozen tissue. Infection would be a danger if left untreated. She cleaned the wound, binding it as best as she could while the man lay unconscious, too weak to respond. Her thoughts drifted briefly to her own past, to the night she had spent alone, tending to her own wounds and surviving when all seemed lost. She understood the importance of care, not just for survival, but for restoring hope. When the bounty hunter awoke, he was confused and wary. His eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the fire, the blankets, and the woman standing over him. For a moment, he did not speak. He had been taught to trust no one, and strangers often brought danger. But the princess's presence was different. There was no anger in her eyes, no demand for payment, no threat. Only a calm, steady understanding. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. "I am someone who believes no one should die in the snow if it can be helped," she replied simply. Her voice was soft, yet carried the authority of someone used to commanding respect without words. She helped him sit up, offering him water and food. "You are badly wounded. You need rest." He looked at her carefully, studying her movements. There was a strength about her, a confidence born of survival. He realized she could have left him to die, but she had chosen otherwise. A strange sense of gratitude mixed with his disbelief. He had been alone in the mountains for hours, believing death was near, and now a stranger had saved him. The realization was humbling. Days passed, and the bounty hunter slowly regained strength. The princess tended to him with patience, teaching him to move carefully, to avoid slipping on ice, and to respect the mountain's dangers. At first he was silent, reluctant to share his story. Pride and fear made him guarded, but as the fire crackled and the nights grew longer, he began to speak, revealing fragments of his past, the men he had captured, the battles he had fought, and the enemies he had made along the way. The princess listened without judgment, understanding more in silence than most men could see in a lifetime. He noticed her too, studying her quietly in the evenings. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her eyes held wisdom beyond her years, and her movements carried both grace and purpose. He could sense the depth of her experiences, the battles she had fought in secret, the losses she had endured alone. There was a quiet strength in her presence, one that demanded respect without demanding it aloud. Slowly, he began to trust her. The bounty hunter also realized that survival in the mountains was not a matter of skill alone, but of alliance. Alone, he would have been easy prey for the men who hunted him. With her help, he had a chance to recover, to regain his strength, and perhaps to find a way out of the storm safely. The princess had not only saved his life, but she had also shown him the importance of caution, patience, and humility. Every action mattered. Every step could mean life or death. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. Snow piled against the cabin walls. The wind rattled the roof, and the trees bent under the weight of ice. Yet inside there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the shared understanding that had begun to grow between them. Words were fewer than actions, but actions spoke louder. She showed him how to prepare food in the snow, how to check his wounds, and how to move without risking another fall. He learned quickly, not just because he had to, but because he had respect for her skill. In quiet moments, the bounty hunter thought about what had brought him here. His life had been filled with danger, yet he had never encountered a person like her, someone who could challenge the harshness of nature and still retain a sense of compassion. He began to understand that survival was not just about strength, but about connection. Sometimes the right ally could mean the difference between life and death, and he had found that ally in the most unlikely place. The princess, too, reflected on her decision. Helping him had been a choice, and choices carried consequences. She had seen men like him before, outsiders who brought trouble and chaos. And yet there was something different in him. Perhaps it was the way he respected the mountains, or the way he acknowledged his vulnerability without shame. Perhaps it was the sense of honor he carried, even after years of violence. She realized that life sometimes demanded courage not just in battle, but in compassion. As the storm began to show signs of passing, the bounty hunter and the princess knew that their time in the cabin was limited. The mountains would not remain kind forever. There were enemies still searching, and the frozen land offered no guarantees. Yet there was also hope, a fragile, shimmering hope, that they could face what came together. They had survived the storm, learned from each other, and formed a bond built on trust, respect, and the shared understanding of hardship. The bounty hunter began to see a future that had once seemed impossible. He would have to move carefully, plan every step, and consider the dangers that lay ahead. But with her guidance, he felt stronger, more prepared, and more aware of the value of life itself. The mountains had taught him harsh lessons, but she had shown him that survival was not only about skill, but about heart, courage, and the willingness to accept help when offered. As they prepared for the days ahead, both felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The world beyond the cabin was dangerous, full of men who would not hesitate to take revenge. Yet the bond they had formed in the storm gave them strength. The bounty hunter, once proud and solitary, realized that trust and cooperation were not weaknesses, but weapons against the harshness of the Bitterroots. And the princess, who had learned to live alone, understood that even in isolation, connections could be a source of resilience and hope. In the stillness of the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, they both began to see that their lives were intertwined in ways neither could yet fully understand. The mountains had brought them together, tested their strength, and forced them to rely on each other. And as the snow continued to fall outside, they knew that this was only the beginning of a story shaped by courage, trust, and the will to survive against impossible odds. The days that followed were filled with careful work and quiet observation. The bounty hunter had regained some strength, but the mountains demanded more than a partially healed body. Every morning he would rise before dawn, the wind cutting across his face as he stepped outside the cabin. The snow was deep, making movement slow and exhausting. The trees, heavy with frost, bent and creaked in the wind, reminding him that the Bitterroots were alive in their own way, unforgiving, sharp, and dangerous. The Apache princess watched him closely. She had taught him to read the signs of the wilderness, how to sense danger before it arrived, how to move quietly over ice and snow, how to find shelter when storms unexpectedly returned. At first, the bounty hunter struggled with her instructions. His pride made him rush, and his impatience sometimes betrayed him. But she was patient, repeating lessons without scolding, guiding him with steady hands and quiet words. Slowly he began to understand that surviving in the mountains was not about rushing or brute force. It was about careful thought, respect, and timing. Trust was growing between them, though it was an uneasy trust. The bounty hunter was used to working alone, relying on his skill, instinct, and reputation. To admit that he needed help, even from someone who had saved his life, was difficult. The princess, too, had learned to rely on no one, shaped by years of solitude. But necessity had drawn them together, and the mountains had no mercy for those who refused to adapt. One day, as they trudged through a dense grove of snow-laden pines, the bounty hunter noticed footprints in the fresh snow. They were small, careful, almost hidden beneath the powder. He froze, studying the trail. His instinct screamed that danger was near. The princess, seeing the change in his posture, moved closer. Her eyes scanned the forest, noting subtle signs. The broken branch here, the disturbed snow there. She recognized the signs immediately. Someone had been following them. "They are close," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Not far behind. Careful." The bounty hunter nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. He felt the old fear rising, fear he had thought he had left behind. He had survived countless pursuits, but this one was different. The mountains were harsh enough, and now there were men who wanted him dead, hiding in the snow like predators waiting for a mistake. The princess had been right. Survival required caution, strategy, and awareness. They moved together silently, following the trail and watching for signs of ambush. The princess led him to a small ravine, a narrow passage where they could hide from anyone passing above. They crouched behind rocks and frozen roots, watching the snow fall in heavy, relentless waves. Hours passed, and the hunter realized how vulnerable he had been before meeting her. Alone, he would have been caught quickly. Together, they had a chance. During these moments of quiet, they began to speak of their pasts more openly. The bounty hunter shared stories of towns he had visited, the criminals he had tracked, and the families he had helped protect. He did not hide his mistakes or failures, and he did not exaggerate his successes. The princess listened, understanding that every choice he had made had consequences, some harsh, some tragic. She shared her own story in pieces, speaking of her childhood, her tribe, and the raid that had forced her into the mountains. She spoke sparingly, careful not to reveal too much, but enough that he could see the strength she had gained through hardship. Through these conversations, they learned that their lives, though very different, had been shaped by similar forces: loss, danger, and the need to survive against overwhelming odds. They began to understand one another not just as hunter and protector, but as two people bound by circumstance and resilience. Respect grew into cautious admiration, though neither said it aloud. Words were not always necessary. The trust between them was spoken in their actions, in the shared glances, in the silent understanding of danger around them. The snowstorm continued for several more days, each night bringing freezing winds and deeper drifts. The bounty hunter learned the patience required to endure long nights in the mountains, to ration food carefully, and to keep his mind alert. The princess taught him how to build small traps for animals, how to melt ice for water, and how to find dry wood for the fire even when everything was covered in frost. These lessons were small, but they were vital. Each one could mean the difference between life and death. One evening, as the fire burned low in the cabin, the bounty hunter looked out the window at the swirling snow. He could see shadows moving among the trees, faint, almost invisible. His heart tightened. His enemies were not far away. The princess, noticing his tension, placed a hand on his shoulder. She did not speak, but the gesture carried a message. They would face this together. The next day, they decided to move from the cabin to a safer location. The mountains were full of hidden paths, narrow valleys, and secret shelters. The princess knew them all. She guided him through winding trails that avoided detection, through forests where snow muffled their steps, and across streams where ice could hide tracks. The bounty hunter followed closely, learning to trust her instincts and to anticipate the dangers she predicted. As they traveled, the bounty hunter began to see a new side of the princess. She was not only a skilled survivor, but also clever and resourceful. She could find paths where none seemed to exist, and she could spot danger long before it became visible. He realized that her life in the mountains had honed skills that surpassed his own in some ways. While he had experience in tracking men, she had experience in tracking life itself, reading signs, predicting events, and understanding nature's subtle messages. One afternoon, they encountered a frozen river, wide and treacherous. The ice cracked under their weight, and the bounty hunter nearly fell through. The princess acted quickly, grabbing his arm and pulling him to safety. They paused, both catching their breath. He looked at her with newfound respect and gratitude. "I would not have survived that," he admitted quietly. "You would have, eventually," she replied, her eyes serious. "But it is better to survive with guidance than to learn the hard way." As the days passed, their bond strengthened. They shared meals by the fire, huddled together against the cold, and watched for signs of pursuit. The bounty hunter began to trust her completely, realizing that in the mountains, trust was a weapon as powerful as a rifle. He also began to understand that he could rely on someone without fear of betrayal, something he had rarely experienced in his life of danger and pursuit. But trust was only part of survival. The enemies he had made were clever and determined. Tracks in the snow showed that they were still searching, moving cautiously and waiting for the right moment to strike. The bounty hunter knew that eventually they would catch up. The princess sensed it too. They both understood that their time in the mountains was a temporary reprieve. Preparation was essential. One night, as the wind roared and the snow fell in thick sheets, they sat together by the fire. Silence stretched between them, comfortable and necessary. The bounty hunter reflected on his past pride, realizing that he had underestimated both the mountains and the people who inhabited them. The princess had not only saved his life, but had taught him humility, patience, and the value of partnership. For the first time, he felt that he could face danger not alone, but with someone who understood the stakes as well as he did. The princess, too, considered their situation. Helping him had been a choice, and that choice had consequences. The snow-covered mountains were unforgiving, and enemies could appear at any time. Yet she felt a strange sense of purpose in guiding him, in sharing her knowledge, and in facing the unknown together. She understood that survival was more than a matter of skill. It was a test of heart, courage, and wisdom. As the storm began to ease and the snow softened under the weak winter sun, they prepared to leave the safety of their temporary shelter. The bounty hunter packed what he could, carefully placing supplies in his worn saddlebag. The princess secured the cabin, making sure it would remain hidden for anyone who might follow. They both knew that the journey ahead would be dangerous, but they were ready. The mountains had tested them, shaped them, and forced them to rely on one another. Now, they faced the challenge together. Moving forward, they would encounter many obstacles: frozen rivers, hidden cliffs, and the ever-present threat of men who hunted the bounty hunter. But with each step, the bond between them grew stronger. They had survived storms, learned from one another, and discovered that trust and cooperation were as vital as courage and skill. The mountains were still dangerous, but they had found a way to navigate them together, turning the harsh wilderness from an enemy into a challenge they could face as one. In the Bitterroots, life was measured by endurance, awareness, and cleverness. The bounty hunter and the Apache princess had learned these lessons through fire and ice, snow and silence. Each day they grew stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the land around them. They were no longer merely survivor and rescuer. They were partners, linked by necessity, courage, and the knowledge that the mountains demanded unity. The sun dipped below the ridges, casting long shadows over the snow. The wind began to calm, leaving a quiet hush in its wake. The bounty hunter and the princess paused on a ridge, looking out over the frozen expanse. They could see valleys, forests, and ridges stretching into the distance, beautiful and treacherous all at once. It was a land that had tested them, taught them, and shaped them, and now they were ready to face the next trial, whatever it might be. The bounty hunter and the Apache princess moved carefully through the Bitterroots, each step taken with attention and caution. The snow beneath their boots was soft in places, hard and slippery in others, and the cold wind cut sharply across their faces. Though the sun had begun to shine faintly after the storm, the mountains still carried a silent threat. The bounty hunter knew that his enemies were still searching for him, and the princess knew the wilderness could be just as dangerous as any man. The bounty hunter had begun to rely on the princess's knowledge of the land. She guided him over narrow ridges, around hidden cliffs, and through forests so thick with snow that it muffled every sound. They moved like shadows, careful to leave no tracks, careful to make no unnecessary noise. The mountains had taught them patience, and every cautious step strengthened the bond between them. But the safety they had found in the cabin and the mountain paths could not last forever. Rumors of the bounty hunter's survival had begun to spread in the distant towns below. Men who had lost fortunes, men who had lost family members, and men whose pride had been wounded, all sought revenge. They were cunning and determined, willing to risk the harsh winter to catch the man who had evaded them so long. Soon the bounty hunter realized they would face more than just the wilderness. They would face men who had nothing to lose. One evening, as they rested near a frozen stream, the bounty hunter spoke quietly. "They are coming," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "I can feel it. They know I'm still alive. They will track us here soon." The princess nodded. "I have seen signs. Tracks hidden in the snow, broken branches that do not belong. They are clever, but not clever enough to escape notice entirely. We must be ready." He looked at her, admiration and concern mixing in his gaze. "I've faced dangerous men before, but I have never met someone like you. You are remarkable." She smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of understanding. "We all survive in the way we know."
I have learned from the mountains. You have learned from men.
Together, we have a chance. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden movement across the frozen stream. Shadows shifted in the snow, faint at first, then clearer as they came closer. The bounty hunter froze, rifle raised. The princess crouched beside him, silently analyzing the situation. The men approaching were armed and alert, moving with the precision of those who had been trained for tracking. They were relentless, moving as if they believed the bounty hunter had no chance of escape. The bounty hunter's heart pounded. He had known this day would come, but facing it now, he felt the weight of the mountains, the snow, and the unknown. The princess placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "We have prepared for this," she whispered. "Do not let fear guide you. Think, move carefully." As the men drew closer, the bounty hunter and the princess took positions behind large rocks and fallen trees. They could see the glint of metal, rifles and pistols catching the weak sunlight. The hunters were determined, confident that they had the advantage. But the bounty hunter and the princess were ready. They had studied the land, learned the patterns of movement, and prepared for this encounter. The first shots rang out, echoing through the mountains. Snow flew in small clouds as bullets struck rocks and ice. The bounty hunter returned fire, careful to aim without revealing his exact location. The princess moved silently, using her knowledge of the terrain to position herself where she could observe and protect. They worked together without words, each action supporting the other. Every shot, every movement was calculated. The battle was brief but intense. The hunters had underestimated their target and the companion who had aided him. One by one they fell back, retreating into the trees and snow, realizing that the bounty hunter was not the easy prey they had expected. The princess remained calm, covering his movements, guiding him to a safer path through the frozen landscape. When the hunters finally disappeared from view, the bounty hunter lowered his rifle, exhausted but alive. They paused, leaning against a snow-covered tree. The bounty hunter looked at her, awe and gratitude in his eyes. "I could not have done this without you," he said. "You saved my life again, and not just once." She shook her head slightly. "We saved each other. Survival is never a matter of one person alone. Remember that." After the encounter, they knew that their journey could not continue in the open. The bounty hunter's enemies would return, and they would be better prepared next time. The princess suggested they find a more hidden place to rest, a location where the snow and rocks would protect them from both the elements and any pursuers. They moved carefully, each step deliberate, every sound measured. During their travel, the bounty hunter began to share more of his past, revealing mistakes, regrets, and moments of fear he had never admitted to anyone. The princess listened, her presence calm and unjudging. In turn, She spoke more of her life, of her tribe, and of the raids that had forced her into the mountains. The stories were painful, but they also created understanding. Each tale revealed the resilience of the other, and each lesson strengthened their bond. They found a small cave hidden among rocks near a frozen waterfall. It was shallow, but it offered protection from wind, snow, and prying eyes. Inside, they built a small fire and arranged supplies for the next days. The bounty hunter examined the cave with careful eyes. He had survived many battles and he knew the value of strong positions. The princess guided him to safe spots, areas where they could observe the surroundings without being seen. The nights were long, and the days were filled with preparation. They sharpened tools, secured weapons, and planned escape routes in case the hunters returned. The bounty hunter reflected on his reliance on the princess. He had learned that survival required more than courage. It required cooperation, strategy, and trust. And in the mountains, these qualities could make the difference between life and death. One evening, as they rested near the fire, the bounty hunter asked, "Why did you help me?" "You didn't know me. You could have left me to die." The princess looked into the fire, her face calm and steady. "Because survival is more than avoiding death. It is about making choices that matter. You were in danger, and I could help. That is enough reason." Her words struck him. In all his years tracking men, capturing outlaws, and facing danger, he had rarely encountered someone who acted without expectation of reward or recognition. The mountains had forced him to rely on himself, but the princess had taught him that sometimes reliance on others was not weakness, but strength. The next morning, the bounty hunter and the princess moved cautiously toward a narrow pass that would take them deeper into the mountains. The snow was lighter now and the wind had calmed, but the threat of pursuit remained. Every tree, every ridge, every shadow could hide danger. They moved as a unit, silent and alert, their footsteps careful and deliberate. As they traveled, the bounty hunter realized that the mountains had taught him humility. The wilderness had forced him to slow down, to observe, to anticipate, and to rely on someone he had once considered a stranger. The princess had changed the way he viewed survival, danger, and trust. He understood that courage alone was not enough. Wisdom and partnership were equally vital. They reached a ridge that overlooked a valley below, the frozen landscape stretching for miles. Tracks in the snow suggested that the hunters had returned, but they were scattered, confused by the mountainous terrain. The bounty hunter knew they would try again, but with the princess's guidance, he felt prepared. They had survived storms, pursued enemies, and learned to rely on one another. Their bond had become a weapon as strong as any rifle. As they settled near the ridge for the night, the bounty hunter and the princess reflected on the journey so far. They had faced danger, survived ambushes, and grown stronger together. Yet they knew the challenges were far from over. The mountains were vast, and the enemies below were relentless. Their survival depended not only on skill and courage, but also on understanding, strategy, and the unspoken trust they had forged in the snow and ice. In the quiet of the night, the bounty hunter realized that the princess had not only saved his life physically, but had also restored something deeper: hope. In a world of danger, betrayal, and harsh wilderness, she had shown him that trust, understanding, and courage could exist, even against impossible odds. And as they watched the stars above the frozen peaks, both knew that the story of survival, trust, and courage was only beginning. The bounty hunter and the Apache princess had endured storms, blizzards, and relentless pursuit through the Bitterroot Mountains. They had learned to survive together, to rely on each other, and to read the subtle signs of the frozen wilderness. Yet even with all their preparation, the final challenge lay ahead. The men who hunted the bounty hunter were clever, determined, and willing to risk the harsh winter for revenge. Their enemies would not give up easily. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the final confrontation. Early one morning, just as the weak winter sun began to rise, the bounty hunter and the princess surveyed the valley below from a ridge. Tracks in the snow confirmed their fears. The hunters had returned, more organized, more relentless than before. They had split into smaller groups, surrounding the area. attempting to cut off any escape. The bounty hunter's pulse quickened, but he did not panic. He had faced danger countless times, and now he had an ally whose knowledge of the mountains rivaled his own. "We have to be careful," the princess said quietly. "They will be watching the obvious paths. We need to move where they least expect us." The bounty hunter nodded, loading his rifle with precision. "We can turn this to our advantage," he said. "If we can predict their moves, we can control the outcome." They began to move along a narrow ledge that ran parallel to the valley floor. Snow clung to their boots, and each step required careful balance. The bounty hunter's shoulders still throbbed from his previous injury, but he pushed through the pain. The princess led the way, scanning the terrain, listening to the wind, and reading the subtle signs in the snow and trees. Together they moved like shadows, almost invisible against the white landscape. Suddenly they heard a shout from below. One of the hunters had spotted movement. Instantly, the bounty hunter and the princess crouched behind a large boulder. Bullets struck the rocks around them, sending sprays of snow into the air. The princess whispered instructions, guiding the bounty hunter to safer cover. Their movements were synchronized, each action supporting the other. For hours, they engaged in a deadly game of strategy and survival, using the mountains to their advantage. The bounty hunter realized that the princess's skills were more than survival. They were tactical brilliance. She anticipated the hunter's moves, directed him to weak points in their positions, and helped him set traps with careful precision. One by one, the hunters were caught off guard. Some fell into snow-covered pits. Others were forced to retreat after narrowly avoiding the bounty hunter's accurate shots. The mountains became an ally, each rock, ridge, and tree aiding them in their defense. Despite the danger, there were moments of quiet determination. The bounty hunter and the princess would pause behind cover, catching their breath, sharing brief words, and planning their next moves. They had learned that fear was a tool, not a weakness. Awareness and calm could turn even the most desperate situation into an advantage. The princess reminded him constantly that survival was not about brute force alone. It was about understanding, patience, and courage. Hours passed, and the hunters began to realize that they were being outmatched. They were skilled, but the bounty hunter and the princess had an intimate knowledge of the mountains and each other's strengths. Every attempt to surround or ambush them failed. The hunters grew frustrated, their movements more reckless, and the bounty hunter saw opportunities to turn their mistakes against them. He relied on the princess's guidance, trusting her instincts completely. Finally, the hunters retreated, realizing that their quarry would not be caught easily. The bounty hunter lowered his rifle, exhausted but relieved. The princess joined him at the ridge, her eyes scanning the valley below to ensure the threat had truly passed. They had survived not just because of skill, but because of trust, strategy, and the bond they had formed in the mountains. For the first time since the pursuit began, the bounty hunter allowed himself to feel a sense of victory. He had faced relentless enemies, survived blizzards, and endured injuries that would have ended a lesser man. And he had done it not alone, but with someone he had once considered a stranger. The Apache princess had not only saved his life multiple times, but had also shown him a new way to survive, through partnership, trust, and respect for the land. As the snow began to soften with the faint warmth of the sun, they moved cautiously toward a safer path that would take them out of the immediate danger zone. The bounty hunter reflected on the journey so far. He had learned that courage alone was not enough to survive. Wisdom, patience, and the willingness to trust others were equally important. The mountains had tested him, but the princess had taught him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. They stopped near a small grove of pine trees, where the wind was lighter and the snow less deep. Here they could rest and plan their next steps. The bounty hunter looked at the princess, admiration clear in his eyes. "I owe you more than I can say," he said. "I would not have survived without you." She shook her head gently. "We survived together. That is what matters. You would have done the same for me if the roles were reversed." They shared a brief moment of quiet, understanding the unspoken connection between them. Survival in the Bitterroots had forged a bond stronger than words. They had faced danger, adversity, and the unforgiving wilderness, and they had done so together. The mountains had tested their courage, skill, and endurance, but they had emerged not only alive but stronger, wiser, and connected. As the day wore on, the bounty hunter and the princess continued to navigate the rugged terrain. They moved slowly, carefully, always alert to the slightest sign of danger. The mountains still held secrets, but they had learned to read the land, anticipate threats, and trust each other completely. Every step reinforced their bond. Every moment of survival deepened their respect for one another. The bounty hunter began to reflect on the meaning of his life and work. He had spent years tracking outlaws, bringing men to justice, and surviving countless dangers, yet in all that time he had rarely encountered someone who challenged him not with force, but with wisdom, courage, and insight. The princess had changed his understanding of strength, showing him that survival required not only skill and courage, but also heart, trust, and humility. The princess in turn reflected on the bounty hunter. She had spent years in solitude, relying on her own knowledge and skill to survive. She had learned to expect betrayal and danger from every corner. Yet he had proven himself trustworthy, brave, and willing to learn. Together, they had faced threats that neither could have overcome alone. The mountains had forced them to rely on one another, and in doing so they had discovered a partnership that was stronger than any weapon. As night fell over the Bitterroots, the two settled near a sheltered area where they could rest safely. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky, reflecting off the snow and casting a pale light over the mountains. The bounty hunter and the princess sat quietly, listening to the wind, feeling the cold, and reflecting on their journey. The danger was not entirely gone, but they had survived the greatest threats. They had outwitted their enemies, navigated the harsh terrain, and relied on each other in ways neither had expected. The bounty hunter spoke softly, almost to himself. "I never imagined I would survive this winter. I never imagined I would find someone like you. The mountains are harsh, but together we are stronger than any storm or enemy." The princess nodded, her gaze steady. Strength comes in many forms. It is not only in the gun or the skill to fight. It is in trust, wisdom, courage, and understanding. We have learned that together. In the following days, they continued their careful journey through the mountains. They avoided paths that might expose them, moved quietly, and used the land to their advantage. The bounty hunter's enemies never caught up to them again. The mountains, which had once seemed an endless challenge, had become a place where they had proven their resilience, strategy, and partnership. Eventually, they reached a point where the landscape opened into a valley less dominated by snow and ice. The bounty hunter could see distant trails that led toward safer towns, away from the hunters who had once pursued him. The princess, too, recognized the area as a place where they could rest, gather supplies, and plan the next stage of their journey. They both knew that life beyond the mountains would bring new challenges, but they were ready to face them together. As they paused to look back at the peaks they had crossed, the bounty hunter felt a sense of gratitude and awe. The mountains had tested him in every way, physically, mentally, and emotionally. They had forced him to confront fear, patience, and the limits of his own skill. Yet he had survived not alone, but with the Apache princess who had saved him again and again. Their bond had carried them through storms, ambushes, and the harshest wilderness in the West. The princess felt a quiet satisfaction as well. She had chosen to help the bounty hunter when she could have left him to the snow. That choice had led to survival, trust, and a connection that would endure beyond the mountains. She had shared her knowledge, faced danger, and discovered an ally who valued courage, intelligence, and wisdom as much as she did. Together they had turned the Bitterroots from a place of peril into a testament to resilience, partnership, and courage. As the sun set over the valley, casting golden light over snow and rock, the bounty hunter and the princess made their final preparations to leave the mountains. They knew that life would continue to present challenges, but they had faced the impossible and survived. The mountains, frozen and unforgiving, had tested them, and they had emerged victorious, stronger, and united. The story of survival, courage, and trust in the Bitterroots had come to its conclusion. The bounty hunter had been saved not only from enemies and snowstorms but also from despair. The Apache princess had found purpose, partnership, and proof that even in the harshest conditions, trust, skill, and courage could triumph. And as they left the mountains behind, the snow settling silently over the peaks, they carried with them the lessons of the Bitterroots, that survival is as much about heart as it is about skill, and that trust and courage can turn even the coldest, harshest wilderness into a place of hope.